Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, May 16th, 2022, and tomorrow there are a number of primaries set to occur in some very important states, including the state of North Carolina, where, as you can tell from the title of this video, this is going to be about how Donald Trump saved the Republican Party and allowed them to have a strong candidate in the 2022 North Carolina Senate race this November. The reason why I am making this video is because there is a poll that just came out from the Hill and Emerson College. They are one of the few pollsters that have gone into the state of North Carolina to actually get us data to understand how this race is going to go. They find that Ted Budd, the sitting U.S. representative from, I believe, North Carolina's 3rd congressional district, is in a 27-point lead over every other candidate, and the North Carolina Senate general election shows Ted Budd winning his race by 7 points, but Pat McCrory losing by 5. Now, the reason I think this is really showing is because of a very unpopular candidate on the side of the Republican Party, and that is former Governor Pat McCrory. We'll talk about a bit about his history and how Donald Trump specifically turned this race around from what could have been a very bad ploy for the GOP, a very bad candidate that ultimately has handed them someone now who is going to likely soar to his first election to the United States Senate. So taking a look at the first and foremost polls that we look at for this race, we're looking at the North Carolina Senate Republican primary for 2022. This election, again, will occur tomorrow, and we will know by the end of it, more than likely, that Ted Budd will win that nomination process. But it didn't always look like that, at least very early on. Real Clear Politics only dates back to January 2022, but Pat McCrory had a 5-point lead over Ted Budd at this point in time. But the interesting thing is that it actually was a much larger lead for Pat McCrory very early on. To give you a bit of an understanding about who the candidates are, Ted Budd actually is from the 13th district, not the 3rd district, but he's a sitting U.S. representative versus Mark Walker, who is a former U.S. representative, one of the biggest proponents of President Trump, and Pat McCrory, the former mayor of Charlotte, North Carolina, and the former governor of North Carolina. A very recognizable name, someone who had won statewide back in 2012, lost in 2016, someone that Republicans knew, but I wouldn't exactly say someone that Republicans loved. If you take a look at the endorsements, Pat McCrory actually got Richard Burr, the incumbent right now that is leaving office in the state of North Carolina. Richard Burr has really fallen out of favor within the GOP, thus that's why his endorsement really doesn't hold much weight. If you take a look at Mark Walker, he has received the endorsement of Mike Huckabee, Madison Cawthorn, Paul Ryan, Mick Mulvaney, recognizable names within the GOP, but the most important endorsement of them all went to Ted Budd from President Donald Trump. When he made this endorsement, it was a huge deal because Laura Trump had said that she was not going to run because of family issues in this race, sort of indicating that she might run in the future, and as a result, Donald Trump was looking for who to choose. And Donald Trump played it smart. He chose the right candidate. But again, like I was saying, it didn't always start out with such a lead. If you take a look at the early numbers, you will actually see that Pat McCrory started out nearing 50% in preliminary primary polls. If you take a look at literally every single one that came in 2021 and early 2022, Pat McCrory had a very large lead. 48% to 9, 40% to 5, 45% to 19, 45 to 21, 40 to 25, 36 to 33. Then it started to build back up. 30 to 21, 24 to 19. Leads that were large for Pat McCrory, and it looks like he was on a pathway to victory, especially very early on. And the reason for that also was because in polls where Laura Trump was included, you found that she was defeating Pat McCrory. She was doing well, and Trump's name carried her across the finish line. But when she left, Donald Trump had to make an endorsement. And I think a lot of people expected partially that Pat McCrory would get the endorsement. But instead, Donald Trump opted for Ted Budd. Now, again, the interesting thing about this is that Ted Budd started out with 9 and 5% across the state. Only later down the line did he get more recognition. And Trump's endorsement actually came in April of 2021, meaning that these polls taken before only showed Pat McCrory and Ted Budd at the points before Trump had even made an endorsement. Donald Trump did two things right. He chose the right person and he made the endorsement early. Had he endorsed Ted Budd today, I don't think Ted Budd would have won this primary. What we find here is that Donald Trump's endorsement held so much weight that it completely changed the trajectory of the race, even if it took time to load in. Because I made a video talking about how Trump's endorsement in North Carolina didn't seem as if it was super effective, and I think that was very accurate for that point in time. Donald Trump's endorsement should have skyrocketed Ted Budd's chances at victory, and it did, just way later than expected. It took about a year for it to actually get into full effect, but in every single poll since then, Ted Budd has been maintaining a very strong lead. But again, went from nothing to now literally winning the Republican primary and more than likely winning that general election. Pat McCrory has certainly fallen out of favor from the voters in the state of North Carolina. So as for the part that actually gets into how did Donald Trump save the GOP, well, I would like you to take a look at the 2016 presidential election results. And you might be thinking, why are we looking at this? Well, it's important in understanding how Pat McCrory lost a race that should have been otherwise winnable. Donald Trump won against Hillary Clinton in North Carolina by a margin of 3.2%. He was able to beat her in an exceptionally large fashion, especially considering where everyone else thought the rest of the nation was going to go. People had predicted North Carolina was going blue, that Florida was going blue, that Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, blue, Iowa, Ohio, blue, easily. There were even some considerations that Clinton might win Georgia, Arizona, and in some extreme cases, people argued that Texas was within reach for Hillary Clinton. But obviously, none of that came to fruition, and as a result, Hillary Clinton lost the state of North Carolina by a larger margin than what Romney beat Barack Obama by back in 2012. Donald Trump won by 3.2. But then you look at the down ballot races and you find, okay, Richard Burr, as the incumbent, outperformed Donald Trump in the state of North Carolina. But one person in specific certainly did not. And that was Governor Pat McCrory, who lost to Governor or Attorney General at the time, Roy Cooper, by 0.2%. It doesn't seem substantial, but this means there were voters out there that willingly backed down ballot Republicans, backed Richard Burr, backed Donald Trump, but would not vote for Pat McCrory, and thus he lost the election. This prompted Roy Cooper 4 years later to win the governor's race by 5 points when Donald Trump was still winning the state of North Carolina. Pat McCrory lost this race, and he lost in a year where he really should not have lost. This was a year in which he could have just ran on the coattails of President Trump, but he was so unpopular that he ended up losing. In addition to this unelectability dating back to 2016, you saw the polls that I mentioned very early on. The numbers don't lie. Sherry Beasley isn't changing as the Democratic nominee. State Senator Jeff Jackson dropped out months ago to allow her to easily win the nomination process, to focus on the general election. And what you find is that Sherry Beasley loses by a large amount to Ted Budd, by 7 percentage points across the state. But even by mentioning Pat McCrory's name in opposition to her, her support goes up by 3%, and the Republican Party support drops by 9%. Sherry Beasley wins this election by 5 points. And I honestly wouldn't put it past her. Looking at the presidential election results, it is clear that a Republican can win statewide while Pat McCrory loses. His unpopularity hasn't been forgotten by the people of North Carolina. The only reason why he was winning in the primary to begin with was because of name recognition. Had Donald Trump not made the endorsement for Ted Budd would not be where he is right now. Donald Trump single-handedly changed the trajectory of this race. Looking at polls from even before the one I'm looking at most recently, from back in April, the numbers are the same. They find that Sherry Beasley defeats Pat McCrory by 2. But it's interesting to see that in a month later, when the Republican Party is now doing, or the Democratic Party is now doing worse than they previously were doing, surprisingly enough, Sherry Beasley has improved her margin by an overall 3, her percentage of vote by 1, and Pat McCrory has lost 2% of the electorate. You take a look at the numbers with Ted Budd, you find that Ted Budd might have reduced by 2, but so did Sherry Beasley. At the end of the day, there is a 9-point difference in the first poll between Ted Budd and Pat McCrory, and what seems to be now a 12-point difference between the two front-running Republicans. And if we're being honest about it, the only real frontrunner here is Ted Budd. This is where Donald Trump's endorsement really matters, and how he can come back in 2024 if he is to run and say, Senator Ted Budd only won because of me. Democrats would have won North Carolina had I not intervened, had I not used my political prowess in the Republican Party, had I not exerted that. This state could have gone blue, and realistically, it probably would have. Pat McCrory was just the level of unpopular to lose in 2016, and I know it's the case, on one hand, that the state itself is going to likely vote more conservative than it did in 2016 because of where we are nationally, but never underestimate how an unpopular candidate can really screw things over for an incumbent party. Think back to Alabama. Think back to any case in which Democrats have lost a solid blue state, with an open race, for instance, in Massachusetts, in Maryland. If someone is unpopular, they very well could lose the general election, even if a state itself already seems like it might be lopsided in one way or the other. Pat McCrory was at a point where he very well could have won this primary, but I see no pathway to victory for him in tomorrow's primary. He might surprise us by getting maybe a third of the vote, as undecided sort of break down through the remainder of the candidates, but I can't imagine it'd be much more than that. Donald Trump's weight and influence in North Carolina has paid off. 6 months ago, it didn't look as if it was going to. 8 months ago, it certainly didn't look as if it was going to. And a year ago, while the numbers did improve for Ted Budd, again, Pat McCrory was still in the lead. Donald Trump's endorsement hasn't been holding much weight in states such as Pennsylvania, where he endorsed Dr. Haas quite some time ago, and yet he's still only leading by 2.6. You have other races where Donald Trump's endorsement isn't holding the merit and the weight that you otherwise might want it to be, at least if you are that Trump-endorsed candidate. But in North Carolina, the waiting game paid off. Ted Budd was just in the race. All he had to do was continue waiting the long game, and he ended up lucking out. Donald Trump's endorsement here was probably very much unexpected, but I'm sure he's very appreciative of it now. Because from going from someone who started out in the first poll at 9%, second poll at 5%, and the most two recent polls at 43 and 45% of the Republican primary vote, in a field of about 10 candidates, at least 10 recognizable candidates in the Republican primary, it is quite interesting. Donald Trump's endorsement has done a lot of wonders for the North Carolina GOP in this case, because I do think they could have messed up the general election. Because when you take a look at the numbers, when you take a look at actually who is now in this position in the general, you find that Ted Budd almost always defeats Sherry Beasley. But when you take a look at Pat McCrory, that isn't always the case. There are very few exceptions, I would say, where you can find anything where Ted Budd is doing worse than Pat McCrory. I think the one poll is that number from March 2022, Redfield and Wilton Strategies from November 2021, where Ted Budd performed worse than Pat McCrory. But since then on, Pat McCrory has done considerably worse. Donald Trump's endorsement carries Ted Budd across the finish line and will likely carry him through the general election. Looking at the generic Republican versus generic Democrat numbers too, you find that the generic Republican wins by 6, by 12, by 1, by 1. Most recently, the only number from 2022, by 6 points. When you have Ted Budd winning by 7, it tells you he's outperforming the generic Republican by 1 point, whereas you find that Pat McCrory is underperforming by a super significant amount. I mean, it's not even comparable at this point in time. So in tomorrow's primary, I would invite you to take a look at where the Republicans end up. Because should there be a major upset on Pat McCrory's side, that could alter the trajectory of where we are at this point. I think North Carolina has been pretty much sitting pretty as it stands on my map. At no point in recent history or at all in my channel did I have North Carolina as blue throughout this entire election season. And there was a reason for that. Because it did not look at any point like the Democrats were going to win here. In my most recent projection, I have it as lean Republican, but I could be swayed to moving it over into likely because this characterization is by margin. Ted Budd being up by 7 isn't unbelievable at all. Ted Budd very well could win by 7, considering that Democrats lost here by 6 points in 2016 and that 2022 is likely to be a better year for the GOP than 2016. But it could have gone very, very bad, but the GOP should be very grateful for what Donald Trump did and his influence on this race, because Richard Burr chose the wrong guy. The former governor of North Carolina chose the wrong guy. This was not someone, Pat McCrory was not someone you wanted to nominate. If you're looking at it from a strategic and a realistic perspective, he was not the one. But he almost was, and that should be terrifying to the GOP, but they should take in that sigh of relief and sort of think about it for a moment and realize that Donald Trump really saved them in this circumstance. I'm not trying to at all indicate or argue that Republicans owe Donald Trump something for this, but I do think it is a very big thing to note and a very impactful point as we stand right now, and really tells us a lot of Donald Trump's endorsement in North Carolina, and also a bit about how long the endorsement needs to set into voters, and how him choosing the right candidate really can change the trajectory of an otherwise would-be competitive Senate race. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch. Oh my gosh, sorry about that. There's a video you can watch and then a playlist for you to go ahead and watch as well. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.